Thanks so much for joining us today, Adam.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to our discussion because I think what we're going to touch on is is going to help a lot of people kind of at the root. A lot of us in Western society, we are part of the Western medical paradigm. We see a certain doctor and we're given certain diagnoses, and that can lead us down a path. And I think what we're going to examine today is taking a step backwards from that and how maybe re-examining that can lead us to evaluate different ways that we can perhaps seek out some healing. So I'm really
Yeah.
looking forward to this. Awesome. So if you could start by telling us a little bit about your area of research and what drew you to that area.
Sure, yeah. My name is Adam, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the field of medical anthropology. Yeah, medical anthropology is a very broad area, but basically it's looking at medical cultures, yeah, both from the perspective of like the dominant, hegemonic, let's say, biological, evidence-based medical cultures that we have in Western countries, but also just all sorts of different medical systems around the world and how different people around the world live and experience health and illness and, different diagnoses, different treatments, and so on and so forth. And a subset of that area of medical anthropology also touches on cultural psychiatry, which is more my field, which I kind of like come from the field of mental health. But looking at mental health, not necessarily from a more mainstream psychological or psychiatric clinical perspective, but really from a cultural, healthy, or to experience a sort of mental or psychic distress.
We
So
we
that's kind of like a very,
Sorry,
yeah.
we lost you. Skype lost you for a minute. So
Oh, okay.
can you back up about two sentences?
Yeah. So I was talking about the subset in the field of medical anthropology that focuses on cultural psychiatry, yeah, which is a subset of medicine, which is a subset on the field of medical anthropology um, that looks specifically at mental health, but not necessarily from a biomedical or psychological clinical perspective, but more from a cultural perspective. Yeah, how do different people around the world experience and live psychic distress or psychic suffering, or just what does it mean to be mentally healthy? Yeah.
All right.
Uh, and I came into this field because I started out studying psychology, and I grew up in Israel. So I grew up very close to Tel Aviv, and then I did my undergrad studies in the country. And as I was a psychology student, I was also simultaneously already working, and I was working mostly in psychiatric environments, both kind of like midway homes for people that were diagnosed mostly with psychotic disorders, so people that were diagnosed with schizophrenia, bipolar depression, and also I was working in a psychiatric hospital in the inpatient ward, so people who were in acute states of what biological psychiatry calls psychotic disorders. And I really enjoyed working with people. I really liked like being of service to people who were experiencing extreme psychic suffering, but at the same time, I also felt out of place. I felt that I wasn't really bringing my gifts in the way that I could, mostly because of the limitations of the system. The way that biological psychiatry and mainstream psychology address mental illness or mental suffering seemed to me to be inadequate. And I started having moral or ethical concerns about it. And I just at some point decided that even though I really enjoyed working with people, I couldn't participate in that system anymore, and that I wanted to go out and find better ways, better methods to really help people that were experiencing serious mental discomfort. Yeah, and it started from the very basics. What does it mean for people to be mentally ill? What does it mean for people to be mentally well. What is it that we talk about when we're saying psychosis or schizophrenia or anxiety or depression, all of these labels and terms, and just kind of like deconstructing back, taking like a step back and really examining what it is that we're talking about when we talk about these things. So I went out into the world and I started traveling around, and I spent time in many different places, mostly in traditional societies. I spent 1 year more or less in India. I spent a lot of time down in Peru. I spent a lot of time in Mexico, trying to figure out how do people in non-Western or not Westernized countries deal with psychic or mental distress, and what are the approaches that they take. And this is kind of like always tied in within like the spirituality of different cultures, the cosmologies and mythologies of different cultures. These things are always kind of like intertwined. What is the dominant ideology or the dominant mythology in certain places? So after a few years of doing that, I went back to academia and I went back to university, but I didn't really feel called to continue down a clinical path or to go back to like mainstream psychology, but rather to, again, like just take like a broader outlook on health and well-being through anthropology. So I signed up for a graduate program in medical anthropology, and from then onwards, that's kind of like been my field of focus. I finished my master's, in which basically I focus on deconstructing mainstream biological psychiatry, which is a whole topic on itself. And afterwards, I was kind of like left out with a question, like, okay, now I kind of understand why this system doesn't work, yeah, but that doesn't really give me answers as to what does work, yeah. And from then onwards, I was like, okay, so let's find out how can I really be of service to people? What other alternatives do we have? What other systems do we have? What other insights can we learn from other cultures or other places so we can offer better services to people who are experiencing extreme or mild psychic and mental suffering. And I wanted to really find a place that could function as that archetype or that blueprint for what, let's say, next paradigm healthcare service can be like. And I ended up traveling to the Amazon rainforest. I have been interested and continuously engaged with psychedelic and plant medicines for quite a while. So that was kind of like my first intuition was like, okay, I know that psychedelics and plant medicines have had a major impact in my own life. I know that they have helped me immensely throughout my growing up. So this would be like a very good avenue to explore as how can that be extrapolated into society as a whole to really, there's this very well-known quote by Stanislav Grof, who is one of the fathers of current psychedelic psychotherapy. And he said, psychedelics potentially are for psychiatry and psychology what the telescope was for astronomy back in the day. Like this can be the most meaningful, important tool that we have to get a really good insight into the workings of our own minds, and hence also when our mind goes awry. And I ended up accepting a job in an ayahuasca retreat center in the Amazon rainforest, which pretty much seemed to me to embody, that, like just like that quality of really being a place that could function as a next paradigm healthcare service at the service of people, and not necessarily at the service only of pharmaceutical industries or the medical industrial complex, but really something that had as a priority the well-being both of individuals but also of communities and the environment as a whole. So for the last 4 years, on and off, I have been living in the Amazon rainforest in a center that is called the Temple of the Way of Light, which nowadays is pretty much one of the most prestigious and well-known and recognized ayahuasca retreat centers, where I have been coordinating research projects. We have a few different research projects happening simultaneously. The main one has been happening for the last 4 or 5 years, a collaboration with ICEERS and the Beckley Foundation. These are two organizations that are at the forefront of psychedelic research nowadays. I'm just kind of like giving the basic details for listeners who may not be as familiar with these names. So ICEERS and the Beckley Foundation, again, are two big names and big players in the current revival of psychedelic research, particularly as far as the academic aspect of it, and also more the legal aspect of it, like really bringing to the forefront the importance of having a reform in the global arena of drug laws and so on and so forth. And another thing that I'm doing also is I have like an ongoing collaboration with the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College in London, which is also nowadays one of the most important centers, right, as far as the current revival of psychedelic research. So anyway, what I'm trying to say that for the last 4 years, I have been focusing on these collaborations with all of these different organizations, really trying to examine, and communicate in a way digested and absorbed, not only by people that are already interested in these topics, but really by the mainstream academic and medical establishments. How do we translate all of the wisdom from these millenarian Amazonian cultures, all of the centuries of knowledge, of empirical knowledge, really, that indigenous people have amassed on how to work properly with these different plants, the relationships that they have with the environment? How do we translate that into terminologies that can be absorbed and digested by the medical establishments? It's really kind of like a cultural and epistemic translation of different things into different terms. And in addition to that, I've been facilitating workshops. So I'm also a facilitator in the retreats and workshops that we offer. So every month we get something around 75 to 80 people that come from all over the world to partake in these workshops that combine kind of like the best tools that Western psychotherapeutic technologies have to offer, but also like a very grounded approach that is rooted really in the Amazonian epistemologies and cosmologies and the medical practices that have developed within particularly the Shipibo nation, which is one nation, an Amazonian nation that has become very well known for their expertise in Amazonian medicine, particularly the work around ayahuasca. I realize that I've been talking for a while, so I'm going to shut up and pass the word back to you.
Pass the word. You're too funny. Well, there was no way I was going to cut you off because that's all fascinating and gives us a lot of background as to what you're going to bring, to this discussion, which is you've been a facilitator. You've been down at this ayahuasca retreat for a number of years doing research with these major organizations. Like, you're just casually name dropping like 3 of the largest, most important psychedelic organizations. And by the way, anybody listening, if you're really into psychedelic science, this may come out after the conference, but I know you're speaking at ICPR 2020 this year, which is at the end of September, which is all psychedelic science. And so if this does not come out after this, no guarantees, guys. But that's something to check out. If it comes out after, then check out, just follow them and check out their 2021 conference. But you brought up so many things, and so many things that are especially near and dear to my heart with the Psychedelic Medicine Association, where we're trying to bridge the gap between Western medical establishment and what's going on in the psychedelic science world. And that one of the things you talked about is just, it gets down to even something such as basic as terminology. because the terminology
Yes.
can help us communicate better, but it can also divide us, even maybe from ourselves. If, like you had mentioned, talking about the different identities that we have. And we touched on this a little bit. I know James Fadiman touched on this in the episode for a few weeks ago, but when he was talking about depression, he was saying, like, I don't necessarily refer to depression when I'm talking about microdosing. I'm talking about microdosing for people who are feeling sad. And I
Yes.
think today in our really medicalized society, we kind of skip the feeling and go straight to the diagnosis. And it's from, like you said, doctors have to put a DSM code in our little notes when we see a patient. It's just how we get reimbursed, and the whole system is set up for us to have, we can't say I saw a patient for sad. It's not really something we can write down. And so that
Yeah.
we end up telling the patient, you have depression, and then the patient might set an identity, I am a depressed person, and that sets a whole thing in motion. So can you talk a little bit about maybe the more traditional view on, like you said, mental suffering?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, really important part of all of this work, particularly with ayahuasca, which is really to, in a sense, is to decolonize our minds from the grasp that these labels and these concepts can have on our whole experience. Yeah, I mean, we do live in a world where medical expertise is regarded as kind of like the ultimate authority, medical knowledge, and that actually, is not necessarily a bad thing. When it comes to psychiatry, is where things can get a little bit tricky because of the somewhat problematic history of biomedical psychiatry. Yeah, and kind of like many efforts throughout the decades that psychiatry has done to legitimize itself as a biomedical tradition, but actually hasn't been very successful in it. Like has been kind of like a very frustrating path for many researchers to really find those biomarkers of like those different mental diagnostic constructs that we tend to think about as if they were real. So, just to give an example, if a person goes to a doctor because they have some sort of, pain in their belly, there's also different blood tests and different different exams that a medical doctor can run, and then they can say like, hey, actually, because of these results in your bloodstream or because of these different values in the different measures, we can say, that you probably have hepatitis or you have diabetes or you have, there's measurable tests that people can do. When it comes to psychiatry, it doesn't really work that way because psychiatry is mostly subjective. Yeah, like person would go like, hey, like I'm feeling sad and it's been like this for a while, and there's like different, like boxes that a practitioner will tick. But for the most part, psychiatry relies on this subjective report from the patient, and then a practitioner who takes all of those different symptoms, right, all of those different experiences that the person is reporting as having, and then clumping them together and sort of like mistaking them in a way for objective signs of an underlying pathology that person is experiencing that has some sort of biological etiology or some sort of biological origin, which we haven't really found. That hasn't really been the case for most, if not all, psychiatric diagnostic constructs. But one of those problems, one of the main problems is that because of the dynamics within like the world geopolitical arena, Western biological psychiatry also has these pretensions to be universal. Yeah, as if these diagnostic constructs are applicable not only to people in the United States or Australia or United Kingdom, which to some extent may share some of the same cultural, social backgrounds, but also applicable to Amazonian indigenous people and also applicable to Indonesian or Papua New Guinean traditional people, which has been incredibly tricky. Like you have now, for example, just, out of the top of my head, like there have been efforts by the Brazilian government, for example, to medicate indigenous Amazonian Brazilian children with methylphenidates and different amphetamines, trying to impose on them this idea of ADHD, which, you know, it's no more than a very Western diagnostic construct that is based on ideas that come from Western capitalistic, individualistic societies that are mostly focused on production and consumption and so on and so forth. So when you take a construct like ADHD and you say, oh, like that Amazonian indigenous child, you know, like shares the same biological disease and needs to be medicated with amphetamines, it gets trickier. I mean, this is a whole other, this is a very broad subject. But what I'm trying to say, for example, is when you actually go to the Amazonian people themselves, and, you know, at the place where I work, we do this all the time, because when people come for a workshop, they get a personal consultation. And what a personal consultation means is that each one of the participants in the retreat will have a space to express what it is that what it is that they came for, both with us, which are Western facilitators present, but it also will have 5 other Shipibo healers present, right? So a lot of Westerners will immediately, you know, begin their sharing by saying, well, I have been depressed for so-and-so years, or I have been paralyzed by this overwhelming anxiety for so-and-so years. And more often than not, we as Western facilitators, we need to translate to the Shipibo healers, not only language, but also what do this label means? You know, because for a Shipibo indigenous Amazonian person, when a person is saying anxiety or depression, these things don't mean anything. Like this, like the Shipibo healers don't experience life in these terms. Depression and anxiety are meaningless for them. So, you know, we need to translate and say, oh, this person is depressed. Yeah, he's been feeling sad for a very long time. But it's not regular sadness. It's a kind of sadness that, you know, prevents you from maybe getting up from your bed in the morning. It's a kind of sadness that prevents you from wanting to connect with other people. It's a kind of sadness that is really deeply rooted in this sense of like, you know, like it's difficult to explain what depression means, other than just in terms of like sadness. Anxiety is the same. You know, for a Shipibo healer, when a person is anxious or a person expresses that is feeling a lot of anxiety, they translate that into, oh, like that person is very worried. Like that person has a lot of worries. He's worried about a lot of different things. And not all of those things that he's worried about are actually rooted in the physical, material reality of that person. Not all those worries are just kind of like imagined worries that that person has. Of course, for the person that is feeling anxiety, that doesn't mean anything. I mean, I personally struggle with anxiety. I have struggled with anxiety for quite a while. I know very deeply what neurotic anxiety is like. And I know that no intellectual understanding that many of these anxious thoughts are just neurotic things that I make up in my mind and are not rooted in actual reality. That doesn't always help me feel better about it. Yeah, but for a Shipibo person, you know, oh, so look, let's see how can we help that person to feel less worried about things that he shouldn't feel worried about. Or let's see how do we help this person be able to process that sadness in a way that is healthy and adaptive, so he can actually feel the sadness and he can actually allow that sadness to be fully embodied, so he can eventually move past the body and be let go of, as opposed to that sadness lingering in a way that is not healthy and adaptive for that person, because he will be carrying that sadness with him. And then, you know, like that depression can be felt over time. So there's a very big difference in how the Shipibo healers address depression as opposed to just lingering sadness, or anxiety as opposed to just, you know, like worries.
Wow.
Yeah,
This
and
is
that
super fascinating, by the way. Go ahead.
Yeah.
You,
And you know, like many of the insights that we get from cultural psychiatrists and medical anthropologists that have done research in all sorts of different places, is that tends to be, you know, like a very common thing amongst traditional people, or let's say less westernized communities or societies, where experiences of mental suffering or mental distress tend to be experienced in a way that is much less pathologizing or much less referring just to the individual, as if it was the fault of the person, or just whether that's like bad genetics or bad biology or childhood trauma or whatever. Like we tend to think in terms of, oh, like I'm depressed or I'm anxious because there's something wrong with my brain chemistry. Like there's something that is not right with my serotonergic system or my dopamine system, and I need, that pill or that pill, the treatment that is going to increase the levels of serotonin or dopamine or GABA or whatever it is in my brain. So we tend to have like this very extremely reductive view of mental distress as if it was located mostly in our synapses, which hasn't worked out great for most people. Like there's an increasing amount of backlash or resistance to this view of reducing meaningful human experiences merely to the malfunctioning of our brains. Whether for most traditional people or traditional societies, then that's just not how things work. If a person is feeling sad or a person is feeling anxious, it is very unlikely that the community will tell that person like, hey, like there's something wrong with your brain, but rather they're gonna say like, hey, like, like how are your relationships? Are you feeling held by your community? Are you engaged in life in a way that feels meaningful for you? Like, is there anything that we can do to make you feel more integrated or more held? Like, it is not about a person taking a pill, but about the community really engaging in helping out that person to figure out what is happening with them and hold them until they can just feel better. So it's just like very different approaches. And apparently, and this is also like one of the main insights of cultural psychiatry, is that for all of the technology that we have and the pharmaceutical advancement that we have and so on and so forth, actually, when it comes to mental wellness or psychic well-being, Western and Westernized countries usually fare much worse than traditional societies where people don't have access to these different approaches. So it says a lot, just not only about the failure of kind of like the hegemonic mainstream biological psychiatric approaches, but also about what it is that is the importance of tightly knit communities and, like more relational cosmologies and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that makes total sense, and I really appreciate that thorough explanation. I love that vision of the people seeing not like what's this disease. It's like, no, everybody has sadness, and you just may have more sadness that's been lingering for longer, but it's less of kind of like that, like you said, there's something pathologically wrong with your neurology or your biology or your genetics. Like, no, you're having a human emotion, maybe more than you're comfortable with. Let's see how we can address that. And so from that point in your workshops and in the work of the Shipibo people, how do they, once they understand the issue that the person is coming with, how do they use ayahuasca and other tools to address that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So it's kind of like hard to begin to approach what the Shipibo or Amazonian medical system is like, but it's maybe useful to begin. Every medical system or every medical approach is inseparable from the culture, the cosmology, the metaphysics that underlie the understanding of that culture about what the world is like, right? So we in the West have an extremely materialistic, physicalistic understanding of wellness and illness because we live in a world that is basically materialistic, in a world that is made of atoms, where everything that exists is a function of this mechanical cause and effect between particles and so on and so forth. Amazonian traditional people don't share the same metaphysical or cosmological assumptions that we do. Yeah, most traditional people around the world are the same, and to this day, Amazonian cultures experience the world in a way that some anthropologists call animistic. Yeah, animistic beliefs or animistic experiences. And for animist people, basically, the building blocks of the world are not atoms or quarks, but the building blocks, the fundamental nature of reality is spirit. Yeah. So everything is spirit, and everything is spirit. So humans are spirits, but also non-humans are spirits. So there's trees and plants and birds and fishes and the river and the rain and like the weather patterns. Everything shares the basic fundamental aspect of being the embodiment, the physical manifestation of a shared spirit. Yeah. So for animistic people, and one of my favorite definitions of animism is actually by a scholar of religious studies. His name is Graham Harvey, and he said, animism is the experience that the world is a community of people. Yeah. Some of those people are human people, but there's also bird people and tree people and fish people and non-human people. Yeah. And life in these communities is always lived paying a lot of attention to the reciprocal interactions between all of these different communities of people, both human and non-human. Yeah. So in a sense, there isn't a radical difference between a human person and a tree or a plant or a jaguar. Yeah. We all share the same basic core of humanity, to say that in a way, except all of us just take different physical shapes. Yeah. So there's many things that we attribute only to humans in kind of like the Western anthropocentric perspective. Like, okay, so, you know, we know that we are intelligent, we're sentient, we are agency on the world, and the fact that what we do has an impact on the world. We can communicate with each other. But those oftentimes are taken to be exclusively human attributes. Whether for animistic people, that's not the case. The same things that we can attribute to a human person can be attributed to a tree person or a plant person or a jaguar person. So the plant or the tree, they can communicate, they can be intentional, they have agency upon the world, they feel emotions, you know, they can be happy, they can be sad, they can be triggered. And the medical system that they have emerges from this basic understanding of the world, this reciprocal relational cosmology, where we're always and constantly in relationship with beings that share the same level of humanity as we do. Yeah. So the way that the Shipibo medical system works, which is the same way that many Amazonian medical systems work, is that the healing doesn't necessarily happen only through the agency of the human healer, but the human healer works in a sense as a channeler, yeah, of the medical agency of different sources or different spirits in the environment. So, you know, like the apprenticeship of, in the Shipibo Nation, for example, this word healer or curandero in Spanish, or the widely misused term shaman, which is just an aberration of anthropology that shouldn't really be used. But, you know, for an indigenous shaman, in the Shipibo language, they call themselves onayas. The onaya term derives from the term uni, which uni is a Shipibo word for ayahuasca. Yeah, so ayahuasca is kind of like just like an overarching Quechua name that is given, but every nation or every people that work with ayahuasca have an autochthonous name for it. In the Shipibo language, it is uni, and uni translates to wisdom or knowledge. And the healer is the unaya, which is literally the person who works with wisdom or knowledge, the person who knows, the person who is wise in many ways. Yeah. And the apprenticeship process of the unaya is not necessarily the way that we think about it in our Western mindset. Like that person doesn't go through like several human teachers who teach him like the intricacies of the medical system. I mean, they do have human teachers and human masters in many ways, but the apprenticeship really relies on crafting a personal, direct relationship with the intelligence of the different beings that inhabit their environment, which happens to be the Amazon rainforest. Yeah. So there's this concept of the dieta, which is a Spanish word, diet. The apprenticeship process for a Shipibo healer entails multiple diets. And a diet is not only like not eating enough calories so we can get thin, but a diet is something that is much more complex, that encompasses within it a whole range of different mystical and spiritual technologies, to call it in some ways. Some of them are pretty universal. I mean, fasting is something that happens all over the world. We find fasting as a spiritual technology in Sufism, in mystical Christianity, in Judaism, in all of the Vedic Oriental traditions and so on. Also social isolation, yeah, like the person would go on a diet, they would leave their village, they would leave their community, they would go like deep into the rainforest and be in a hut or be in a clearing in the forest, and for several weeks or sometimes even months, just be by themselves, not seeing anyone, not speaking to anyone, just focusing on their own inner world while fasting or while like getting like a very, very, very restricted intake of food. So social isolation, fasting, all of these are like pretty universal techniques. What is pretty unique in Amazonian vegetalismo is, in addition to that, the person would be drinking or bathing or somehow engaging with a particular plant or a particular tree from the Amazon, which is known by the community to have medical or therapeutic properties, or to have some sort of wisdom that can be learned or can be known by the person if they are able to get into a state of openness where they're able to open up a channel of communication with the spirit of that particular plant or that particular tree. Yeah. So the fasting, the isolation, the meditation, all of these are techniques that are focused on allowing that person to be receptive enough over time to be able to listen, yeah, and get the information that they're seeking from the elements or the spirits of the plants, the trees, whatever it is that they're trying to connect with in that moment. The way that it happens is usually through song. Yeah, I mean, really, really, really important aspect in Amazonian medicine is the sonic element, the auditory element. So communication doesn't necessarily happen in a way that most people would like think verbally. Like it's not like you're, after 2 months of being isolated and really, really hungry, that particular plant or that particular tree is gonna start talking to you and telling you whatever it is that you wanna or need to know. I mean, that happens sometimes for some people, but most times it's more subtle. Some people will experience that more through dreams, through visions, through, I mean, it's very symbolic, it's very Jungian in that sense of like archetypes and symbols. And oftentimes, most importantly, it will happen through song. People receive a particular tune or a particular, like the song of it, which they correlate with a particular medicine that that particular tree or that particular plant is gifting them. And that is known in Shipibo medicine and in Amazonian medicine as a whole as an Icaro. Yeah? The Icaro, which is the main tool that Amazonian ayahuasca practitioners, particularly Shipibo healers, but not only, the Icaro is the main tool that they have in order to address what it is that that person is needing. So they will sing, yeah, they will sing to the person in the medicinal space, but their songs are not necessarily something that they made up, at least not when you ask them, hey, like, where did you learn that Icaro, or how did you get that Icaro? They will say, like, that Icaro is the embodiment of the frequency, the amplitude, the vibration of the medicine that that particular plant or that particular tree or that particular element has, and I'm just channeling that medicine of that particular tree in a sonic form so that I can project that into your body and you can absorb that, yeah, in the form of the vibration and frequency. And that is the main healing tool that they have. So this is a little bit difficult, obviously, for a Western mindset to really acknowledge. But I mean, this is something that needs to be experienced. When you're sitting in ceremony, particularly under the influence of very strong psychoactive brews, and you have like this wonderful, wise person in front of you who is singing to you, and every note that comes out of their mouth kind of like reverberates and is felt in the cells of your body. It's something that cannot really be understood or construed intellectually, but needs to be experienced to have a sense of how that works. So that was kind of like a very long roundabout to answer your question, which is, hey, so that particular person is feeling very, very sad or is feeling very, very anxious. How does the Shipibo practitioner address that sadness or that anxiety? Well, they have particular songs, yeah, that are specifically designed or specifically received to allow that sadness or that worry or that fear or that whatever it is that is stuck emotionally in the energetic body of that person. So that song is designed to allow that emotion to be dislodged and unlocked from where it is that it is stuck in the energetic body of that person, and be thoroughly experienced by bringing it back to the surface. Oftentimes, I mean, like this is kind of like a very wide subject, but oftentimes when we're depressed, there's many things that underlie that depression. It can be like a sadness or anger that hasn't like really been thoroughly acknowledged. Oftentimes it has been repressed, oftentimes because it's very hard for us to really address that sadness, particularly if it has been an extremely traumatic thing in our lives that brought up that emotion. So the Icaro allows for that emotion to be brought back to the surface so we can actually address that face to face once again and say like, hey, like, yeah, I don't want to run away from this particular experience anymore. I want to allow it to be thoroughly experienced, thoroughly felt, so I can fully experience that experience as opposed to suppressing it, so it can move through me faster and I can actually move on with my life without having that stuck and weighing on my experience as much as it has. So that would be kind of like a sort of rudimentary explanation based on my personal understanding of how that system works. But by no means is the only understanding that can be given to an extremely complex and mysterious way in which Amazonian medicine, particularly like the sonoric medicine of Anícaro works.
Well, yeah. I appreciate it very much because I had a base understanding of Icaros and how they worked, and that filled out so much more. I always wondered how they came to people and didn't quite understand exactly how they were used in those particular ways to unlock things and help move them through. So thank you very much for that thorough explanation. I really appreciate it. And so now that we have this image of people are taking the medicine, but the Icaros are doing a lot of the healing. But you had brought, before we started recording, we were chatting about the relational aspect of ayahuasca and how it helps us realize not only our relationship to ourselves and our emotions, but our relationships with others. Can you describe a little bit about how the ayahuasca, the relational aspect and how it brings those to light?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually the thing that I'm mostly interested in, and that's kind of like the cornerstone of the research that I'm doing, is precisely that relational aspect that is illuminated or brought to the forefront of our understanding through our engagement with ayahuasca. And again, that's kind of like an extremely important aspect, particularly because most of us in Western or heavily like westernized societies, we're also heirs to the main ideologies or doctrines that permeate our societies. One of the most important of those being like this individualistic or hyper individualistic focus that we have inherited from romanticism and also different influences. And most of us experience life with an overpowering, let's say, an overpowering obsession with our individual micro dramas, yeah, and our own experiences. I mean, we are the center of. I mean, that's fine to some extent, yeah, but also that excessive focus on the me, yeah, has also a lot of different unhealthy repercussions on our lives. Yeah, I mean, it's not only creating a culture of narcissism and obsessive compulsive, like, yeah, it's like this obsession with the self, but also is really contributing a lot to these epidemics of disconnection that we're experiencing. One of the really important aspects of this, and this is something that is becoming more and more and more and more well understood within even the medical establishment, is the impact that social alienation and loneliness have on our well-being. Nowadays, loneliness actually is being acknowledged as one of the most important factors or risk factors for public health. We are living through an incredible epidemic of loneliness. All of us, most of us, are very lonely people. And this is because all of the different social and cultural factors, yeah, that are creating our Western industrial consumerist individualistic societies also have a vested interest in constantly eroding more and more and more our connectedness with each other. Yeah, there is a vested interest in creating this alienation, that loneliness, in eroding our social bonds. And this is, like one of the main aspects of consumerism is precisely that, like the main reason or the main thing that will get people to buy shit that we don't really need or engage in services that are not really, like being helpful to us, is that we need to fill that void that is being left out by something that it has been a fundamental aspect of the human experience, which is our innate sense of connectedness to each other, our innate sense of belonging to a tribe, to a tightly knit community. There is a void that is becoming more and more and more and more and more felt by many of us. So anyway, when we think about like the current stream of medicalization within the psychedelic community, for example, there is like a very definite felt push towards medicalizing psychedelics as aids for psychotherapy in clinical settings. And I think all of those things are great and they have a lot of value. And they also have some inherent danger in the sense that as we push towards this medicalization more and more and more, we also may be missing what I think are actually the most important benefits or the most important value that these substances have, which are not necessarily therapeutic in the sense of like, medical or clinical or psychological worlds of concepts, but actually are much deeper than that. And they're epistemic, they're ontological, they are relational. These substances not only allow us to have a better insights into, the workings of our own minds or the workings of our own bodies, so we can actually address our own personal individual issues with more clarity, but actually that they go deeper than that. The epistemic aspect, for example, like psychedelics are very, very, in ayahuasca, also does this very well is that they allow us to really question the fundamental aspects about how it is that we acquire information about the world, what it is that we know, what it is that we think that we know about things. So it's not only about like, oh, like how does this substance help me address my depression, but like, what is depression anyway? What is anxiety anyway? Where are these concepts coming from? Where is this information coming from? What are the fundamental blocks in which I base, the knowledge about the things around me? The ontological aspects are also important. What exists in this world? What is it that actually this world is made of? Is this really just a world of atoms and quarks and whatever, or is there something like beyond just what we can see or feel through our senses? And the relational aspect, which actually is the fundamental aspect of ayahuasca in many traditional Amazonian societies. And this is a very important point. When we think about ayahuasca and the traditional uses that it has in the Amazon, which is where it originates, we do need to be paying a lot of attention to the experience of people that have been using these substances for, at the very least, many centuries. And Amazonian cultures, when they drink ayahuasca, for the most part, the focus is not on the individual micro dramas of each individual member, but the focus really is on the cohesiveness of the community, is on strengthening the social bonds between the different participants in the ceremony. It's about allowing people to really think very deeply about how they are behaving in relationship to other people. So it's not so much about me, but me in relation to you, me in relation to that person. Am I being the best person that I can in relation to these other people? Maybe my discomfort, my sadness, my anxiety has to do with the fact that I'm not actually embodying this relationship in the best way possible. And I have gathered some supporting evidence for this in many of the interviews that I have conducted. I mean, for both of these research projects that I have going on, whether it's with ICERS and the other one with the Center for Psychedelic Research with Imperial, I have conducted probably many dozens of different interviews with people after an ayahuasca workshop. And these workshops vary between 9 days to 12 days to 23 days, but all of these workshops have in common that they are embedded within a group setting. Yeah, these experiences happen within a group setting. Usually the groups are 20 people, 22, 23 people. People go through these experiences with 22 or 23 other participants, right? So when I do these interviews, in the beginning, I was kind of like expecting that when I asked the question, hey, what was the most meaningful part of this workshop for you? Or what were the main insights? Or what were the main, like important things that you got from the whole experience? In the beginning, I thought people would focus a lot on the psychedelic part of it. Like, oh, like I had this vision of like angels or plants, or like, like I had like this really fully embodied vision, like more of what people actually imagine when they approach these medicines for the first place, right? Like, oh, I'm gonna meet aliens, or I'm gonna meet like my Pleiadian ancestors, or whatever it is. But actually, that's not the case at all. When I ask people about what are or what were their most meaningful insights, oftentimes there's much simpler answers. And oftentimes the answers are relational, and they have to do with the relationships in their lives. Yeah. It's like, hey, like, like during my third experience, I had this experience where I managed to experience what my father's experience is like. And even though, I hold a lot of anger for my father because he did such and such and such and such, this is the first time in my life where I managed to have the empathy and the space to really put myself in the place of my father and understand why he did the things that he did and have empathy and compassion for his own experience because I saw his own wounds. Yeah. Like I saw his view and his perspective, and I understood that whatever it is that he did to me, he wasn't acting from a space of like really wanting to hurt me, but just because in his own life he had been hurt in such and such ways that was the best that he could have done in that moment in time. And that experience of empathy, of compassion, of understanding what another person's experience was like allowed me to forgive him, or at the very least to be able to find a space where I can actually relate to him in a different way, as opposed to just shutting that in anger and pushing him out of my life. And I think that now I'm ready to go back home and actually get back in touch with him and say like, hey, Dad, I know that it's been 15 years since we last spoke. And I thought that I had already kind of like moved past my need to be in any sort of like relationship with you, but now I'm in a different space where I would actually want to, like I forgive you. I see why you did what you did, and I understand what you went through in your own life. And I would like to try and craft a different relationship because I have found out that actually I'm not okay without estrangement. I'm not okay with not having you in my life, and I would like to try and repair that relationship to the extent that we can in this moment of time. This is just kind of like I just made that up as an example, but these are things that happen every single workshop. Every single workshop, there would be a lot of people who would express that the most important insight or the most important experience that they had has to do with relationships, whether that's a father, of a lover, of a partner, of a child, or somebody who might have died a long time ago. It's about really being able to find that space of relationality again. And this is something that was somewhat surprising to me in the beginning because I didn't understand the importance of that in our alienated, lonely, societies and so on. But the more that I experience this medicine and the more that I learned that about myself, the more that it makes sense. I really think that a lot, if not most of the value that these medicines have for us as Western subjects of post-industrial, disenchanted societies has to do with that capacity that they have for reconnecting us, not only with the aspects of ourselves that we have disconnected from through trauma and so on and so forth, but actually more like the relational aspects of like how we are connected and embedded within our communities, our societies, and furthermore, like the reconnection to our ecosystems. Yeah, like drawing from these Amazonian ontologies or these Amazonian worldviews where the trees and the plants and the animals are not just collections of objects to be exploited for human gain, but actually they have seen and understood and related to as a community of subjects who stand on equal ground with the human kin. Ayahuasca oftentimes will get us to a place where we can actually experience that reconnection with the wider community of sentience that makes the ecosystem of our world, in a sense that these things are not only an intellectual idea, like, oh, I can see that tree also is intelligent, or I can see, that actually, like that patch of rainforest has intrinsic value, beyond how much oil is underneath that, or regardless of how much gold or, whatever metal it is that we can extract from that particular plot of land, or how much wood can we extract. like I can see why people would think that that particular, has intrinsic value. But for most of us, even if it's intuitive, we're still so disconnected from our relationship with the living, sentient, breathing world around us, that still remains just as a intellectual idea. Of ayahuasca oftentimes will give us a very direct experience of like, hey, this is just not an idea. This is just how things work. You are brothers and sisters with the deer and the jaguars and the ants and the bees. Like you're all interconnected. We are all interdependent with each other. This is not just like something that gets written on ecological or environmental journals. Like, hey, like, the bees are not dispensable. If bees die off, then there's not going to be any pollinators. You're not going to be able to grow fruit. You're going to die off. Like this is just like this chain of connectivity and interdependence that permeates the whole world that we are just one part of. And for many people, ayahuasca gives that experience. This is a very common theme for a lot of people. It's like, oh, sometimes, it will be uncomfortable. It's not going to be pretty. A lot of people get extremely depressed or like, extremely shaken by it. Like, hey, like I saw myself as this horrible, like extractive predator in this beautiful world where, but like, I think like a lot of this work is actually facing our shadows. And a lot of people talk about facing our shadows. And I think a lot of people focus on like our personal shadows, like, oh, like, what are my shadows? Like my own personal, like I can speak for myself. Like as I go through this journey, like I have had to face a lot of my own shadows that have to do with my personality or my way of being, like my own arrogance or my own vanity or my own, like my patterns of relating, to other people, what it is that I'm seeking in relationships, like my own insecurities, the fact that I actually need constant external validation from other people and women to feel whole. But still, these things are very important, but they're still in the realm of the personal, of the individual, of my own ego construct. But ayahuasca will oftentimes transcend that particular ego construct and face us with shadows that are much more, I don't know if important, but I would say critical to the cultural zeitgeist and the actual real challenges that we face as humanity as a whole right now. Because we also, if we really need to grow and evolve, it is not only essential that we deal with our own personal, individual shadows, but also, and this is one of the points where a lot of spiritual people fall into these traps of bypassing reality. If we really want to acknowledge our shadows, we also need to talk about the collective shadows, about the cultural shadows, about the shadows that are not necessarily just based into our personal experience, but they're facing the real social, cultural, environmental challenges that we face. Like, hey, discrimination and patriarchy, and these are things that are kind of like getting a lot of traction nowadays, and they're being brought to the forefront of dialogue, both kind of like in also different arenas. And ayahuasca oftentimes, will contribute a lot to that. It will face us with things that we might not be extremely happy to see because it can be extremely difficult to deal with. But like, hey, like you're not as enlightened as you thought you were, and you're still not engaging as respectfully, as consciously, with your environment, with your culture, with your society. Like you still have within you the seeds of patriarchy or colonialism or extraction or like this individualistic mindset that we carry as our cultural baggage in many Western societies. And if you really want to do the work, it's not just about love and light and your childhood trauma and your own personal, but it's also about coming to terms with how you are embedded within your particular community, how you're embedded within that society. What is your role, not only in your own awakening or in your own coming into awareness, but within that reality, what actually is happening in this world. And, we are facing real existential threats. Like this is one of the things that I think is very important to address also when it comes to ayahuasca. Like, like we are facing really existential threats in terms of, the sixth mass extinction, which is already underway, global warming, all of these things, and ayahuasca will oftentimes presents us with like, hey, like this is the reality of the world that you live in. This is the incredible sadness and frustration and grief that all of these different beings are experiencing here in the rainforest. This is like the reality of the Amazon rainforest. I mean, the reality of the Amazon rainforest is not pretty, is incredibly discouraging, is incredibly depressing. The rainforest is not doing very well. I mean, this is true for pretty much every environment in the world. And I mean, this is not the case, maybe to get into like a very detailed description of all of the challenges that we face globally, logically, environmentally. But, like in just to relate that to depression and anxiety, that is very, very, very important, because also because we tend to have like this very individualistic view of what depression is within our own individual brains, we also oftentimes neglect to acknowledge the incredible massive impact that social factors or cultural factors or environmental factors have in our personal well-being. Yeah, like we can't really be happy and healthy individuals if we don't live in healthy and happy communities. We can't be healthy and happy individuals if we don't live in healthy and happy societies. We can't really be healthy and happy individuals if we don't live in healthy, balanced, harmonious, thriving environments. And the reality is that almost nobody, almost no one of us has any of those things. We don't live in happy and healthy communities. We don't live in happy and healthy societies. We are not fed and nurtured by happy and healthy cultures. And we most definitely don't live embedded within healthy and happy environments. So it is very, very, very difficult to talk about individual well-being if we don't also start addressing social, cultural, community, environmental health and well-being. And one thing that I have found throughout my research is that ayahuasca oftentimes will contribute or help at least to get extremely hyper individualistic people with a very obsessive focus on the self. Okay? I will almost call this narcissistic tendencies, which I think is something that extremely widespread within Anglo-Saxon subjects, but also like just in general within like Western cultures. Ayahuasca has that capacity or that quality of helping to yank us out of that hyper individualistic focus and open our eyes so we can start seeing also these different levels of reality, the social, the cultural, the environmental. And once we do that, once we're able to see beyond our own noses and see also the social, cultural aspects, then also we're able to start thinking of our own well-being in those terms. Yeah.
Well, okay. I think that's a fantastic explanation because you're right. Like there's so many levels to what can cause our mental suffering from that, like you said, the micro dramas through our environment. And even like you just said, if we're hyper focused on the micro dramas, we may be missing. It may be kind of a self-fulfilling thing that's creating more suffering because we don't engage with our community and we don't realize that there is a bigger world out there that, yes, some of it is suffering, but some of it could provide support and help with that loneliness epidemic and increase our level of mental well-being. And so I'm glad, and I'm sure most people who've done ayahuasca have had that same thought that like, oh, I mean, maybe not all, but I definitely resonate with the I'm no different from nature. Look at me. Like you just have this oneness feeling very often. And like, I don't know that I could wake up from ayahuasca and like, if I rolled over an ant, I would feel very guilty instantly. Like, like you just have that, we're all brothers and sisters feeling that you described. And I appreciate everything you shared in there. And we're definitely going to have you come back on. You have a lot to share, especially, and I know you have so much research coming up. So we are going to have you back to share what those research findings are. And I'm looking very much forward to it. Can you tell people where they can find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, I mean, my name is Adam Aronovich, so you can just Google my name. There's a bunch of different YouTube videos from different presentations. There's different articles that I've written for different platforms that you can find also online. Published articles and book chapters. I don't really have at the moment a website where I collect all of the different things, but I mean, I should actually do that. That would be a good thing, just for people to be able to find with more ease the different things that I've produced. But yeah, just googling my name and so on, I think is a good thing.
And
Uh,
we'll put that in the show notes too. We'll put links to your stuff. So our
yeah,
show notes can be your little mini website of where your stuff is found.
yeah, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing. I think you've given people a lot to think about because those who have, like you said, mental suffering, you've given them thinking about like deconstructing that diagnosis, a lot of possible causes, some different ways to go about evaluating healing those within and also within our larger communities. So I know that you're going to have helped a lot of people by sharing your story and your journey. And by the way, I know you said you just made up that story about the person with their ayahuasca helping them forgive their father, but it's exactly my first ayahuasca experience. So I think you were just channeling that.
Oh wow.
Impressive. So I was like, yep, all that happened exactly
Yep.
as you're describing. So that was very cool. Thank you again so much for joining us today, Adam.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. For everybody else out there, until next time.